A devoted dog cries endlessly after its owner's sudden passing, breaking the hearts of everyone around him. But when the vet examines the dog's collar, he discovers something shocking. What was the owner hiding? And how will this revelation change the lives of everyone involved, especially the grieving dog? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The morning sun cast long shadows across Gregory Willis's modest suburban home, painting stripes of light and dark on the well-kept lawn. Two paramedics moved with practiced efficiency, but heavy hearts as they wheeled a covered stretcher from the front door. Their faces were grim, shoulders hunched under the weight of another life lost. Small clusters of neighbors gathered on their driveways, speaking in hushed tones about the quiet architect who had lived there for 20 years. "Such a kind man," Mrs. Peterson from next door whispered, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "Always helped me with my groceries." Inside the house, Max sat perfectly still by the door, his brown eyes fixed on the spot where he'd last seen his master. The German shepherd's ears twitched at every sound, waiting to hear Gregory's warm voice calling his name. But the house remained eerily quiet, filled only with unfamiliar footsteps and the low murmur of strangers' voices. As the paramedics carefully loaded the stretcher into the ambulance, Max stepped onto the front porch. His powerful frame tensed as he watched them close the doors. Something deep inside him seemed to understand, and he lifted his head toward the morning sky. The howl that escaped him was raw with grief, echoing down the peaceful suburban street. The neighbors fell silent, several wiping fresh tears from their eyes as the dog's cry spoke the sorrow they all felt. A weathered blue sedan pulled up to the curb just then, and Dr. Nathaniel Carter stepped out. The veterinarian's face fell as he took in the scene: the ambulance, the gathering of neighbors, and most of all, the distressed dog on the porch. He approached slowly, his footsteps careful on the concrete path. "Hey there, buddy," Dr. Carter said softly, crouching down a few feet from Max. The dog's ears perked forward slightly, recognizing a familiar voice. Dr. Carter extended his hand, palm up, letting Max catch his scent. "I know, boy. I know this is hard." Max's tail drooped, but he allowed Dr. Carter to scratch behind his ears. The vet's heart ached as he watched the dog's eyes constantly drift back to the front door, hoping for his master's return. Knowing there was no family to take immediate responsibility, Dr. Carter made a quick decision. "Come on, Max," he said gently. "Let's get you somewhere safe for now." He pulled a spare leash from his pocket, a vet's constant companion, and spent several minutes quietly coaxing Max toward his car. The German shepherd finally allowed himself to be led away, though each step seemed reluctant. As Dr. Carter helped him into the back seat, Max turned his head to stare at the house through the window. The home he'd shared with Gregory now stood silent and empty, its windows dark despite the morning sun. The ambulance pulled away first, its sirens growing fainter as it disappeared around the corner. Dr. Carter's sedan followed shortly after, carrying a grieving dog who couldn't understand why his world had changed so suddenly. The evening shadows stretched long across Gregory's front yard as Dr. Carter unlocked the front door. The house felt unnaturally still, as if time had stopped the moment Gregory's heart did. In the kitchen, a half-empty coffee mug sat on the table, a faint lip print still visible on its rim. Gregory's reading glasses lay folded nearby, and his favorite armchair faced the silent television, a newspaper draped over one arm. Max padded into the house behind Dr. Carter, his nails clicking softly on the hardwood floor. The German shepherd's nose worked constantly, taking in the lingering scents of his master. He circled the living room restlessly, moving from Gregory's chair to the couch, then to the bookshelf where Gregory used to keep treats hidden behind his architecture magazines. "Easy there, boy," Dr. Carter murmured, watching as Max's anxiety seemed to grow. The dog kept returning to Gregory's bedroom, sitting by the unmade bed with an expectant look. Dr. Carter followed him in, flicking on the bedside lamp. A yellow sticky note caught his eye. Gregory's neat handwriting still crisp on the paper. "Max's leash. Don't forget the vet appointment." Dr. Carter picked up the leather leash from the bedpost, but something made him pause. Max's collar looked different from the standard one he remembered fitting during their last checkup. This one was made of rich brown leather with intricate engravings running along its length. He squinted in the dim light, trying to make out the detailed pattern, but the fine lines were too difficult to read in the evening shadows. Moving efficiently but respectfully through the quiet house, Dr. Carter gathered Max's essentials. He found the dog's food in the kitchen pantry, collected his favorite rope toy and tennis balls from a basket by the back door, and located the medical records Gregory kept in his desk drawer. When it was time to leave, Dr. Carter gentle tugged Max's leash toward the front door. The German shepherd planted his feet at the threshold, turning his head to look back into the darkened house. His eyes seemed to take in every detail one last time. The empty chair, the abandoned coffee mug, all the spaces where Gregory should have been. They drove through the quiet streets under a sky full of stars, the veterinary clinic's lights growing closer with each passing minute. Inside, Dr. Carter led Max to a clean, comfortable kennel he'd prepared earlier. The dog stepped inside reluctantly, turning to face the door as Dr. Carter secured it. Max settled onto the soft blanket, his eyes fixed steadily on the closed door, waiting with unwavering loyalty for someone who would never return. Early morning sunlight streamed through the clinic's windows, casting warm rectangles across the reception desk where Dr. Carter sat. The quiet hours before opening gave him time to think, and his attention kept returning to Max's unusual collar. He wrapped his fingers around his coffee mug, the warmth matching the golden light as he studied the leather band. The intricate markings had puzzled him since yesterday. They didn't look purely decorative. There was something too precise about their arrangement. Setting down his coffee, he pulled open his desk drawer and retrieved a small magnifying glass he used for examining skin conditions. Under magnification, the seemingly random pattern revealed itself. Dr. Carter's eyes widened as he recognized the unmistakable format of coordinates. Numbers and symbols were carefully etched into the leather, disguised within the decorative swirls. "Well, he muttered, reaching for his phone. His fingers moved quickly across the screen as he typed in the numbers. The map application loaded and a red pin dropped onto the screen. The location was familiar, a peaceful wooded area just outside town called The Grove. Dr. Carter leaned back in his chair, memories surfacing of conversations with Gregory during routine checkups. "The Grove is my thinking spot," Gregory had once said while waiting for Max's vaccinations. "Something about those old trees helps clear the mind." The coordinates couldn't be a coincidence. Gregory was meticulous in everything he did. His architectural designs, Max's training, even the way he organized Max's medical records. This had to mean something. "Sarah," he called to his assistant, who was organizing supplies in the next room. "I need to step out for a bit. I'll be back shortly." Dr. Carter grabbed Max's leash and walked to the kennel area. The German shepherd lifted his head as Carter approached, his expression a mixture of caution and hope. His tail gave a slight wag, but his eyes held that same watchful intensity from yesterday. "Ready for a little trip, boy?" Dr. Carter asked softly, opening the kennel door. Max stood slowly, his posture alert but uncertain. Once the leash was clipped to his collar, they walked together to Carter's blue sedan. Max jumped into the back seat without hesitation, settling himself with his nose pressed against the window. Dr. Carter started the engine and pulled out of the clinic's parking lot, his phone's navigation directing him toward the Grove's entrance. As they drove, the busy streets of town gave way to quieter roads lined with increasingly dense trees, leading them into territory that felt somehow both familiar and unknown. The morning air was crisp and clean as Dr. Carter pulled into the Grove's small parking area. Ancient oaks towered overhead, their branches creating a natural canopy that filtered the early sunlight. As soon as he opened the car door, Max bounded out, his whole body animated with newfound energy. The German shepherd's nose worked overtime, sniffing the ground with purpose. His tail wagged slightly as familiar scents reached him, and his ears stood at attention. Dr. Carter pulled out his phone, checking the coordinates one more time before starting down the well-worn dirt path. Leaves crunched beneath their feet as they ventured deeper into the woods. The sounds of the distant road faded, replaced by birdsong and the gentle rustle of branches in the breeze. Max walked ahead, occasionally looking back as if to make sure Dr. Carter was following. After about 10 minutes of walking, they reached a clearing dominated by an enormous oak tree. Its trunk was wider than any other in sight, its bark deeply furrowed with age. Max circled the base of the tree, his behavior becoming more focused and deliberate. Dr. Carter's eyes swept the area, landing on a flat stone that seemed oddly placed among the natural scatter of rocks and leaves. Max sat beside it, looking expectantly at the veterinarian. With slightly trembling hands, Dr. Carter knelt and carefully moved the stone aside. Beneath a thin layer of loose soil lay a wooden box, its surface weathered but still solid. Dr. Carter brushed away the dirt and lifted it carefully. Inside, he found several neat bundles of cash, wrapped in plastic to protect them from the elements. Alongside the money was a sealed envelope, slightly yellowed but otherwise pristine. The name Sophia Rains was written across it in Gregory's neat handwriting. Breaking the seal, Dr. Carter began to read. His eyes widened as the letter revealed the truth. Sophia Rains was Gregory's daughter, from whom he had been estranged for years. The money and letter were meant for her, a final attempt to make amends and provide for her future. On the drive back to the clinic, Doctor. Carter's mind raced with possibilities. His own mounting debts and the struggling practice weighed heavily on his conscience. The temptation of the money in the box beside him felt like a physical presence. In the rearview mirror, he could see Max sitting quietly in the back seat, dark eyes watching the passing scenery, completely unaware of the moral struggle taking place in the front seat. As they pulled into the clinic's parking lot, Dr. Carter's face was a mask of conflicting emotions. Guilt and temptation battled across his features as he put the car in park, the box of money sitting innocently on the passenger seat beside him. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead as Dr. Carter turned the key in his office door. The sound echoed through the empty clinic, mixing with the gentle rustling of papers disturbed by the building's ventilation system. He patted his pocket, feeling the weight of his keys, knowing that behind the locked door, Gregory's letter and money lay secured in his desk drawer. The guilt that had been gnawing at him all evening seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. Down the hallway, Max paced restlessly in his kennel. His nails clicked against the concrete floor as he moved back and forth, his dark eyes fixed on the latch of his enclosure. The German shepherd's training, instilled through countless hours with Gregory, began to surface in his mind. His muscles tensed with anticipation as he recalled the specific commands and movements his master had taught him. With careful precision, Max used his teeth to grip the metal mechanism. When that didn't work, he switched tactics, using his paw to push and prod at the latch. Minutes ticked by, filled with quiet determination and focused effort. Each attempt brought him closer to success, his persistence a testament to Gregory's thorough training. Finally, After what seemed like an eternity, there was a soft click as the latch gave way. Max nudged the kennel door open with his nose, stepping silently into the dimly lit hallway. His keen nose picked up the scent of the wooden box, leading him straight to Dr. Carter's office door. He sniffed around the edges, but the solid barrier remained firmly locked, blocking his access to Gregory's final gift. The familiar scent of his former master lingered faintly in the air, strengthening his resolve. Undeterred, Max's training kicked in once more. He remembered Gregory's careful instructions, the countless hours spent learning Sophia's scent from various items. His mission was clear: find Sophia. Max's attention turned to the clinic's side window, where a small gap had been left open for ventilation. The cool night breeze carried promising hints of the world beyond. Moving with purpose, Max approached the window. He pushed his nose against the opening, gradually widening it until there was enough space for him to squeeze through. With the grace of a much smaller animal, he leapt through the gap and landed softly on the pavement outside. The slight ache in his muscles did nothing to diminish his determination. The cool night air ruffled his fur as he stood still for a moment, getting his bearings. The moon cast long shadows across the empty street as Max began to trot purposefully away from the clinic. His silhouette grew smaller and smaller until it finally disappeared into the darkness, leaving only the quiet night behind. In his mind, Gregory's final command echoed clearly: find Sophia and complete the mission they had practiced so many times before. The streetlights cast a soft glow on the empty sidewalks as Max made his way through the sleeping town. His paws carried him past Joe's coffee shop, where Gregory would often sit at the corner table, sketching building designs while sharing his morning pastry with Max. The familiar scent of coffee beans and fresh bread lingered in the air, even though the shop was dark and quiet. Max's pace slowed as he passed the town park, his eyes drawn to the open field where he and Gregory had spent countless evenings playing fetch. The worn tennis ball Gregory always carried was Max's favorite, and the memory made his tail droop slightly. Still, he pressed on, driven by his training and sense of purpose. The local bookstore came next, its windows dark and shuttered. Max remembered lying quietly by Gregory's feet as his master browsed the architecture section, sometimes spending hours lost in the pages of building designs and urban planning books. The German shepherd's muscles ached from his long journey, but these familiar landmarks seemed to give him renewed energy. At a quiet intersection, Max suddenly lifted his head, his nose twitching in the pre-dawn air. There it was, Sophia's scent, just as he'd been trained to recognize. His tail wagged briefly with excitement and determination. He picked up his pace, trotting across empty streets and past silent houses, following the scent that grew stronger with each step. The sky was beginning to lighten as Max entered a residential neighborhood. Row after row of quiet houses lined the streets, their windows still dark in the early morning hours. His tired legs carried him forward until he stopped in front of a modest blue house with crisp white trim. The scent here was unmistakable, a mixture of Gregory and Sophia that told him he'd found the right place. Max's exhaustion began to catch up with him as he climbed the few steps to the front door. His tongue hung out as he panted heavily, his body dehydrated from the long journey. He tried to stand at attention as Gregory had taught him, but his legs trembled with fatigue. Unable to maintain his stance any longer, Max sank down onto the welcome mat, curling his body protectively against the base of the door. His paw scratched weakly at the door as his eyes began to close. Inside the house, Sophia stirred in her bed, roused by the faint sound of scratching. She reached for her phone and opened her security camera app, squinting at the screen in the darkness. Her eyes widened as she saw the German shepherd collapsed on her front porch. Concern immediately replaced her initial surprise. Sophia quickly got out of bed and grabbed her robe from the hook on her bedroom door. She made her way through the quiet house to the front entrance, her heart beating faster with each step. Kneeling beside the exhausted dog, she held her hands suspended above his fur, hesitating for just a moment before reaching down to touch him. Sophia knelt beside Max, her fingers gently parting his fur to check for injuries. A small wound on his leg caught her attention. Nothing serious, but it showed the difficulty of his journey. The leather collar around his neck was unlike any she'd seen before, with intricate engravings that seemed purposeful rather than decorative. "You must be thirsty," she whispered, hurrying to her kitchen. She returned with a bowl of fresh water, setting it down near Max. The German shepherd lifted his head weakly and began to drink, his tail offering a gentle wag of thanks. As she watched him drink, her initial fear of the strange dog melted away, replaced by growing curiosity about his presence at her door. While Max drank, Sophia noticed something tucked into his collar, a folded piece of paper, carefully protected in a small waterproof sleeve. Her hand shook as she carefully removed it. The paper felt delicate between her fingers as she unfolded it, and her breath caught in her throat as she recognized the handwriting. "Dad," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. The words blurred as she began to read, Gregory's familiar scrawl bringing back a rush of memories. Her father's words spoke of deep regret, of love left unspoken, and of his hope that this final gesture might begin to make amends. He explained about Max, how he'd trained the dog specifically for this purpose, to ensure his final message and inheritance would reach her safely. Sophia's tears fell freely now, dotting the paper as she read about the money he'd set aside for her. Her mind spun with the revelation that Max had been entrusted with such an important task. She stood up abruptly, needing space to process everything, and walked to her living room window. Max's eyes followed her movements, his gaze steady and watchful. The morning light was growing stronger now, casting long shadows across her living room floor. Memories of her father flooded back, the sound of his laughter as they worked together on the treehouse in their backyard, the way his eyes lit up when explaining architecture to her. But darker memories surfaced too. The day he left, offering no explanation, leaving behind a confused and heartbroken little girl. Sophia sank onto her couch, the letter still clutched tightly in her hands. How could she reconcile these two versions of her father, the man who abandoned her and the one who had planned this elaborate final gesture of love? Max approached her carefully, his nails clicking softly on the hardwood floor. He paused before her, then gently laid his head in her lap. Sophia's hand automatically moved to stroke his fur, finding unexpected comfort in the simple gesture. She stared at the letter in her other hand, her heart heavy with a complex mixture of grief and questions that might never be answered. Sophia sat at her kitchen table, the morning light streaming through the windows as she carefully reread her father's letter for the third time. Each word seemed to carry more weight now. Her laptop open beside her, she typed Gregory Willis Architect into the search bar, her fingers trembling slightly. The search results painted a picture of a man she barely knew. Articles praised his innovative designs, his commitment to sustainable architecture, and his contributions to the community. Photos showed him at ribbon-cutting ceremonies and industry awards events, always wearing that familiar half-smile she remembered from her childhood. Then she found the obituary, posted just days ago. Her throat tightened as she read about his passing. Peaceful in his sleep. The article mentioned his distinguished career, but noted he was survived by his daughter. Just those simple words made her heart ache with the weight of lost opportunities. Max's soft snoring drew her attention momentarily. Looking at him brought her back to the security footage she hadn't checked yet. She pulled up the app on her phone, scrolling back through the previous night's recordings. Her breath caught as she watched the scene unfold. A man in a white coat, clearly marked with Carter Veterinary Clinic, was struggling with Max near her porch. The footage showed him trying to grab something from Max's collar, but the dog resisted fiercely. Then came the moment that made her gasp. Dr. Carter pulled out a syringe and injected Max, who slowly became drowsy but still managed to escape. "How dare he?" Sophia whispered, her hands clenching into fists. She rewound the footage, watching it again with growing anger. This vet had tried to interfere with her father's final wishes, had hurt Max in the process. The betrayal felt personal, even though she'd never met Dr. Carter. Sophia paced her living room, weighing her options. Calling the police crossed her mind. But how would she explain everything? The inheritance, the trained dog, the secret message? It all seemed too complicated for a simple police report. No, she needed to handle this directly. She needed to look this man in the eyes and demand answers. Sophia glanced down at Max, who had curled up by her feet, his body still recovering from his ordeal. His dedication to completing Gregory's mission touched her deeply, strengthening her resolve. With determined fingers, she searched for the clinic's number and dialed. "Hello, Carter Veterinary Clinic?" "Yes, I'd like to make an appointment with Dr. Carter, please." Her voice remained steady as she scheduled the meeting. Hanging up the phone, Sophia returned to her dining table. She spread Gregory's letter out before her, studying his familiar handwriting as the clock ticked toward her appointment time. The bell above the clinic door chimed as Sophia stepped inside, Max padding faithfully beside her. The waiting room buzzed with activity, a woman cradling a cat in a carrier, an elderly man with a sleepy golden retriever, a young couple fussing over a limping terrier. But Sophia barely registered any of them, her eyes scanning for Dr. Carter. The receptionist looked up with a practiced smile. "Good morning. Do you have an appointment?" "Yes, Sophia Raines. To see Dr. Carter." The receptionist nodded and pressed a button on her desk phone. Moments later, Dr. Carter emerged from a back hallway, his white coat pristine, but his face showing signs of fatigue. The moment his eyes landed on Sophia and Max, he stopped dead in his tracks. Though he managed a polite smile, his shoulders tensed visibly. "Ms. Raines?" His voice wavered slightly. "Please, come this way." "We need to talk," Sophia said firmly, following him down the hallway. Max stayed close, his nails clicking against the linoleum floor. Dr. Carter ushered them into an empty examination room, closing the door behind them. Before he could speak, Sophia pulled out her phone. "I have security footage of you attacking Max last night," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "I have my father's letter explaining everything about the inheritance, and I want to know why you tried to interfere." Dr. Carter's facade crumbled. He sank onto a metal stool, running a hand through his graying hair. I'm so sorry," he stammered, his face pale. "The practice is failing. I'm months behind on bills, and when I found the money," he swallowed hard, "I thought I could use it to save the clinic, pay it back eventually. But I was wrong. So wrong." His voice trembled as he continued, "Gregory was more than a client. He was a friend. What I did, it was a betrayal of everything he stood for." Sophia watched him, her anger still present, but now mixed with unexpected sympathy. The man before her looked broken, defeated by his own choices. "You'll show me where the money is," she said, her tone cold but level. Dr. Carter nodded quickly. "Yes, of course. It's all here in my office safe. I haven't touched any of it." He stood up, keys jingling in his shaking hands. "I'll get it right now." Sophia gestured toward the door. "Lead the way." Together, they walked out to the parking lot, Max following closely behind. With each step, Sophia's heart pounded harder, torn between rage at the betrayal and an unwanted understanding of desperate choices. Dr. Carter's weathered blue sedan pulled around to the back of the clinic, the gravel crunching beneath its tires. The secluded spot was hidden from view by overgrown bushes and a rusty dumpster. Sophia sat rigidly in the passenger seat, her knuckles white as she gripped Max's leash. In the back seat, Max kept his steady gaze fixed on Dr. Carter, his ears alert and forward. The engine died, leaving them in heavy silence. Dr. Carter's hands trembled slightly as he removed his keys. It's in the trunk," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. They stepped out into the morning air. Dr. Carter opened the trunk with shaking hands, revealing a threadbare blanket covering the spare tire well. He pulled the blanket aside, exposing a hidden compartment. From it, he withdrew a canvas bag that looked untouched since the day he'd taken it. "It's all here," he said quietly, extending the bag toward Sophia. "Every dollar, and Gregory's letter, too." Sophia took the bag, her heart racing as she unzipped it. The bundles of cash were exactly as described in her father's letter, neatly wrapped and organized. The original envelope sat on top, its seal still intact. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Back inside the clinic, Dr. Carter collapsed into his office chair, the weight of his actions visible in every line of his face. His shoulders slumped forward, and he buried his face in his hands. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know those words aren't enough, but I mean them. I'll do whatever I can to make this right." Sophia watched him, her anger still present, but softened by the genuine remorse she saw in his defeated posture. Max sat quietly beside her, his tail giving a small wag as if sensing the shift in mood. "My father wanted people to do the right thing," she said softly, running her fingers through Max's fur. "You have a chance to honor that." The words hung in the air between them as Sophia turned to leave, Max padding faithfully at her side. That evening, Sophia sat cross-legged on her living room floor, the soft carpet cushioning her as Max lay faithfully beside her. The canvas bag containing the inheritance rested on the coffee table, its presence both comforting and unsettling. Gregory's letter lay open in her lap, the paper worn from repeated handling. She traced her father's handwriting with her fingertips, reading his words again. "My dearest Sophia," the letter began, "I hope that when you read this, you'll understand that everything I did was out of love, even if I showed it poorly." Her eyes welled up as she continued through his explanations and regrets. Max's warm presence against her leg anchored her as memories flooded back. Birthdays missed, holidays spent waiting, the silence that grew between them over the years. Yet here in her hands was proof that her father had never stopped thinking about her, never stopped trying to make things right, even if he couldn't do it in person. Her thoughts drifted to Dr. Carter's broken expression at the clinic. The desperation in his voice when he apologized had been real, raw with shame and regret. She understood now how financial pressure could push someone to make choices they'd later regret. Hadn't her father's own career choices cost him his relationship with her? Max nudged her hand with his cold nose, pulling her from her thoughts. She smiled softly, scratching behind his ears. His tail thumped against the floor, his eyes full of unconditional love and loyalty. The next morning, Sophia sat at her kitchen table with a fresh sheet of paper. Her pen moved steadily as she composed her letter to Dr. Carter. "Your actions were wrong," she wrote, "but I recognize your remorse and your desire to make amends. I'm choosing not to press charges, but I expect you to honor my father's memory by making better choices." She folded the letter carefully and slipped it into an envelope. The afternoon sun was warm as she drove to the clinic, Max riding shotgun beside her. Inside, the receptionist looked up with a friendly smile as Sophia approached the desk. "Could you please make sure Dr. Carter receives this?" Sophia asked, holding out the envelope. "Of course," the receptionist replied, accepting the letter. As Sophia walked back to her car with Max at her side, she felt lighter, as if a burden had lifted from her shoulders. She paused for a moment, looking up at the evening sky, its soft colors painting the clouds in gentle hues of pink and gold. For the first time since receiving her father's letter, she felt the beginnings of closure settling in her heart. The next morning dawned bright and crisp as Sophia clipped Max's leash to his collar. Her running shoes crunched against the dewy grass as they made their way to the neighborhood park. Max trotted beside her, his ears perked and tail swaying with each step. The park was coming alive with morning visitors. Max's nose twitched as he explored the winding paths, pausing occasionally to investigate interesting scents. His movements were purposeful but gentle, showing his thorough training. "What a beautiful dog!" called out a woman walking a small terrier. "He's so well behaved." "Thank you," Sophia replied, watching Max sit patiently as the terrier sniffed around him. Several other dog owners stopped to chat, commenting on Max's calm demeanor and intelligent eyes. Back home, Sophia spread Gregory's papers across her dining room table. Max settled nearby, his chin resting on her knee as she sorted through the documents. Each folder revealed more about her father's life: architectural drawings, personal notes, and most importantly, detailed records of Max's training. "Look at this," Sophia murmured, finding a notebook filled with daily observations about Max's progress. Gregory had documented everything, from basic commands to complex tracking exercises. His neat handwriting filled page after page with careful instructions and proud remarks about Max's achievements. The afternoon sun was warm as Sophia drove them to the grove, Max sitting alertly in the passenger seat. The wooded area was peaceful, with sunlight filtering through the leaves. Max's tail wagged as they walked the familiar path to the old oak tree. Sophia settled at the tree's base, feeling the rough bark against her back. Max lay beside her, completely at ease in this special place. She unfolded her father's letter, her voice soft but steady as she read the words aloud. Max's ears twitched at the sound, his eyes fixed on her face. Golden light bathed the grove as the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves overhead. Max nuzzled Sophia's hand, and she felt tears well up in her eyes. "Thank you, Max," she whispered, running her fingers through his fur. She understood now how much this devoted dog had helped her through the past few days, bringing not just her father's inheritance, but also a chance for healing. Together, they walked back to the car, leaving footprints in the soft earth of the grove. The setting sun painted everything in warm golden tones, making the moment feel almost magical. Sophia sat at her dining table, papers spread out in neat piles before her. The inheritance money lay sorted into careful stacks, one for outstanding debts, another for savings, and a third for what she hoped would become her fresh start. Max dozed contentedly at her feet, his warm presence giving her strength as she worked through the numbers. With steady hands, she wrote down figures and made calculations. Each decision felt weighted with purpose, a chance to build something meaningful from her father's final gift. The morning light streamed through her kitchen window, catching the edge of her coffee mug as she reached for her laptop. Opening a new document, Sophia began drafting her business plan. The words flowed easily as she outlined her vision for a design consultancy. Memories of childhood afternoons spent watching Gregory work surfaced. The way his pencil had danced across blueprint paper. How he'd explained the importance of balance and proportion. She remembered sitting at his drafting table, fascinated by the precise lines and careful measurements. "Small steps," she murmured, focusing her plan on residential projects in her immediate area. It made sense to start close to home, building a portfolio with neighborhood renovations and local improvements. Max's ears perked up at her voice, his eyes following her movements as she reached for her phone. One by one, Sophia made the calls she'd been putting off. She settled old bills, her voice growing more confident with each conversation. Between calls, she typed an email to Professor Martinez, her favorite instructor from design school. The response came quickly, an invitation to meet for coffee and discuss her return to the field. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she researched local continuing education classes. The community college offered evening courses in the latest design software, perfect for updating her skills. She booked an appointment with the program advisor, adding it to her calendar with a small smile. As evening approached, Sophia clipped Max's leash to his collar. The night air was cool and refreshing as they walked their familiar route around the block. Street lamps cast warm pools of light on the sidewalk, and a gentle breeze rustled through the trees. The tension she'd carried in her shoulders began to ease with each step. Looking down at Max padding faithfully beside her, Sophia felt a surge of gratitude. "This is just the beginning, isn't it?" she asked softly. Max's tail wagged in response, a steady rhythm against the quiet of the night. The morning sun warmed Sophia's face as she pulled into the animal shelter's parking lot. Max sat up straighter in the passenger seat, his ears perking at the sounds of barking from inside. She smiled, remembering how Gregory had always supported local animal causes. Inside, the shelter bustled with activity. Volunteers moved between kennels, and the air filled with excited yips and meows. Max walked confidently beside Sophia, his presence drawing immediate attention from the staff. "Oh my, what a beautiful shepherd!" A woman with kind eyes and graying hair approached them. "I'm Ellen, the shelter manager. Welcome to Second Chance Animal Haven." "I'm Sophia, and this is Max." Sophia shook Ellen's hand. "He's actually part of why I'm here today." They settled into Ellen's small office, where Sophia shared her story. She told Ellen about Gregory's passing, Max's incredible journey to find her, and the inheritance that had changed her life. Ellen listened intently, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "That's remarkable," Ellen said. "Your father sounds like he was a special person." "He was," Sophia agreed, "and now I'd like to honor his memory by helping here." Ellen brightened and led them on a tour of the shelter. She pointed out areas needing attention, worn kennels, outdated equipment, and a particularly shabby outdoor space where the dogs exercised. "This play area is our biggest concern," Ellen explained, gesturing to the patchy grass and aging fence. "The dogs need more room to run and play, but we've never had the funds to improve it." As they talked, Max wandered among the sheltered dogs, approaching their kennels with gentle curiosity. The normally excitable dogs grew calmer in his presence, matching his peaceful energy. "I've never seen anything like it," Ellen marveled, watching Max interact with a typically shy retriever. "He has such a way with them." Sophia felt warmth spread through her chest. "I'd like to fund the renovation of the play area," she decided. "Every dog deserves a chance to run and be happy." Ellen's eyes welled with tears as they discussed the details. Max continued his rounds, stopping at each kennel as if offering comfort to his fellow dogs. Later, as Sophia climbed back into her car, satisfaction settled over her. Max hopped into the passenger seat, and she reached over to scratch behind his ears. "I think he'd be proud of us," she said softly. Max responded by resting his head on her lap, as they began their drive home. Dr. Carter stepped into the animal shelter, clutching a canvas bag filled with medical supplies. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the fresh paint and new fixtures that had transformed the once shabby space. His footsteps echoed on the newly installed flooring as he made his way to the front desk. Ellen's face lit up when she saw him. "Dr. Carter, what brings you by?" "I brought some supplies," he said, lifting the bag. "Vaccines, antibiotics, some basic equipment, things you might need." Ellen's eyes widened as she peered into the bag. "This is wonderful. The shelter can really use these." Dr. Carter watched the construction workers installing new kennels along the back wall. The sight of the improvements, all funded by Sophia's donation, stirred both guilt and hope in his chest. Over the next few weeks, Dr. Carter became a regular presence at the shelter. He established a routine of visiting twice a week, providing free checkups and treatments for the animals. The work helped him find his footing again, reminding him why he'd become a veterinarian in the first place. One sunny afternoon, while he was examining a senior cat, the shelter's front door chimed. Dr. Carter looked up to see Sophia walking in with Max at her side. Their eyes met, and the air grew thick with tension. "Dr. Carter," Sophia said, her voice carefully neutral, "I didn't expect to see you here." He gently placed the cat back in its kennel before turning to face her. "I've been volunteering," he explained, "trying to give back where I can." Sophia nodded, watching as he organized his medical supplies. The silence stretched between them until Dr. Carter spoke again, his voice soft but sincere. "You didn't have to give me another chance, but you did," he said, meeting her eyes. "I'll never forget that." Sophia's expression softened slightly. "Everyone deserves the opportunity to make things right." As Sophia turned to leave, she paused at the door. Through the window, she could see Dr. Carter in the play area, kneeling beside a golden retriever that had just been adopted. His face was bright with genuine joy as he scratched behind the dog's ears. Max tugged gently on his leash, ready to head home, and Sophia allowed herself a small smile before turning away from the scene. The morning air was crisp as Sophia stood in the grove, discussing her plans with Mark, the Parks Department worker. His clipboard held the paperwork for the memorial bench installation, pages fluttering slightly in the gentle breeze. The autumn leaves crunched softly beneath their feet as they walked. "It's a beautiful spot you've chosen," Mark said, gesturing to the ancient oak tree. "The bench will have a perfect view of the sunrise. You'll be able to see the whole valley from here." Sophia nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "My father loved this place," she managed. "He used to come here to think. Sometimes he'd spend hours just sitting under this tree, sketching in his notebook." Mark smiled kindly as they went through the final details. The bronze plaque design was approved, and they marked the exact spot where the bench would rest, carefully measuring the distance from the oak's massive trunk. 3 weeks later, Sophia returned to the grove. The newly installed bench gleamed in the afternoon light, its polished wood surface catching the sun that filtered through the oak's leaves. The craftsmanship was beautiful, smooth curves and sturdy construction that would last for years to come. Max padded alongside her as she approached, carrying a bouquet of white lilies, their sweet fragrance filling the air. She placed the flowers at the base of the bench and sat down slowly. Her fingers traced the cool metal of the plaque, following each carefully etched letter. "In loving memory of Gregory Willis, who found his way home." The metal caught the light, making the words shimmer. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. Sophia reached into her bag and pulled out Gregory's letter, its creases soft from countless readings. The paper had grown delicate with handling, each fold a testimony to how often she'd returned to his words. Max settled at her feet, his warm presence steady and comforting, his brown eyes watching her with quiet understanding. "Dear Sophia," she read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. The familiar words washed over her. Gregory's regrets, his hopes, his final wishes. The letter that had once filled her with confusion and anger now brought a bittersweet peace. Each sentence held new meaning, transformed by time and understanding. She looked around the grove, understanding why her father had chosen this place. The ancient oak stood strong and silent, its branches spreading wide above her like protective arms. Dappled sunlight played across the ground, and a gentle breeze rustled through the leaves, creating a peaceful melody. The setting sun painted the grove in warm golden hues, turning everything it touched to amber and bronze. Sophia took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past few months settle into something lighter, more manageable. The air was filled with the sweet scent of grass and wildflowers. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it away. Standing up, she gave the bench one last touch, feeling the smooth grain of the wood beneath her fingertips. Max rose with her, his tail wagging gently as they made their way back to the car. Their footsteps were quiet on the worn path, leaving the peaceful grove behind them, though she knew she would return often to this place of remembrance and healing. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead as Sophia sat in the college classroom, her notebook open and pen poised. Around her, other students tapped on laptops, but she preferred the feel of paper and ink. The instructor, Professor Martinez, gestured at the projected diagrams while discussing the principles of spatial planning. "Remember," Professor Martinez said, his voice carrying years of experience, "good design isn't just about making things look beautiful. It's about creating spaces where people can live and thrive." Sophia's hand moved steadily across the page, capturing every detail. Her heart fluttered with a mixture of excitement and nervousness as she sketched small diagrams in the margins of her notes. The familiar scent of coffee wafted from her thermos, grounding her in the moment. During the break, Sophia gathered her courage and approached a small group of students chatting near the windows. "Hi," she said, offering a shy smile. "I'm Sophia." "Hey there," a woman with curly red hair waved. "I'm Rachel. Are you new to architecture?" "Sort of," Sophia replied, settling into the conversation. "My father was an architect. I'm following in his footsteps in a way." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "He designed buildings that really meant something to people. I want to do the same." The group listened intently, nodding with understanding. Another student, James, shared his own story about being inspired by his grandfather's carpentry work. The conversation flowed easily, and Sophia felt a warmth spread through her chest. These people understood her passion, her drive to create. Later that evening, Sophia sat at her desk at home, ruler and pencil in hand as she worked on practice floor plans. Max lay faithfully at her feet, his steady breathing a comforting rhythm in the quiet room. Whenever she paused too long, lost in thought, he would gently nudge her hand with his nose. "Thanks for the encouragement, buddy," she said softly, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. The desk lamp cast a warm glow over her work as she continued sketching, measuring, and refining her designs. Hours of careful work later, Sophia held up her first completed design. The modern home concept featured clean lines and sustainable elements, much like the principles her father had championed. With careful movements, she pinned it to the corkboard above her desk. She looked down at Max, who wagged his tail enthusiastically. "I think we're on the right track," she said, reaching for the desk lamp. The room fell into darkness as she switched it off, satisfaction settling over her like a warm blanket. The autumn breeze rustled through the trees at the local dog park as Sophia watched Max trot along the fence line. His calm, dignified presence drew attention from other dog owners, who couldn't help but admire his well-mannered behavior. "What a beautiful German shepherd," remarked a woman with a golden retriever. "He's so well-trained." Sophia smiled, her hand automatically reaching to stroke Max's fur. "He is special," she agreed. "Actually, he helped me reconnect with my father in the most incredible way." As other dog owners gathered around, Sophia found herself sharing the story of Max's midnight journey to her doorstep and the letter that changed everything. The small group listened intently, their eyes widening at the tale of Max's determination and loyalty. "That's amazing," breathed the man holding a terrier's leash. "Dogs really do have a way of bringing people together." Later that day in class, Professor Martinez led a discussion about finding inspiration for design projects. Sophia raised her hand, her voice steady as she shared how Max had become an unexpected source of inspiration. "My father's dog showed me that sometimes the most meaningful connections happen in unexpected ways," she explained. "It made me think about how architecture can create spaces that bring people together, just like Max did for me." Professor Martinez nodded enthusiastically. "That's exactly the kind of personal narrative that can elevate a design from good to extraordinary," he said. "Use that story, Sophia. Let it guide your work." That evening, Sophia sat at her desk, pencil moving swiftly across paper, as she sketched a new design for a dog park. Max lay nearby, his head resting on his paws as he watched her work. The design took shape under her careful hand. Shaded benches where people could gather and chat. Strategically placed water fountains for both humans and dogs, and open spaces designed for play and connection. Max padded over to her chair and nudged her elbow gently. Sophia paused to look at her work, seeing it through his eyes. Every element served both a practical and social purpose, creating opportunities for the kinds of connections she'd experienced that morning. After scanning her sketches, Sophia composed a quick email to Professor Martinez, attaching the preliminary designs. She sat back in her chair, feeling satisfied with the day's work. Max pressed his warm body against her leg, and she slid down to sit beside him on the floor. "You've changed everything, haven't you?" she whispered, wrapping her arms around his neck. The community center buzzed with energy as early morning sunlight streamed through the large windows. Sophia arranged the last of the blueprints on the folding tables, smoothing out their corners with careful hands. Max sat attentively beside her, his tail sweeping the floor as he watched people filter into the room. "Good morning, everyone," Sophia greeted each arrival warmly. The space filled quickly with contractors in work boots, architects carrying portfolios, and eager high school students wearing volunteer badges. Dr. Carter arrived carrying a stack of folders, nodding respectfully to Sophia as he took a seat near the front. His presence, once a source of tension, now felt natural among the gathering of community members. "Thank you all for coming," Sophia began, her voice clear and confident. She gestured to the blueprints spread across the tables. "These plans represent more than just a building renovation. They represent hope for countless animals and the people who will care for them." As she outlined the project timeline, Max moved quietly through the crowd. He stopped here and there, resting his head on a knee or offering a friendly nudge. People's faces softened when they petted him, their attention returning to Sophia's presentation with renewed enthusiasm. "I'd like to coordinate the medical supply donations," Dr. Carter offered, standing up. "I've already reached out to several suppliers who are willing to help." Other volunteers stepped forward, contractors offering discounted services, architects suggesting sustainable materials, and students proposing fundraising ideas. The energy in the room grew with each contribution. "That dog of yours is a miracle worker," commented an elderly volunteer as Max settled next to a nervous-looking teenager, who immediately relaxed and began scratching behind his ears. "He seems to know exactly who needs a little extra comfort." Sophia smiled, watching Max's gentle interactions. "He's been bringing people together since the day he found me," she agreed. When the meeting drew to a close, the room hummed with purpose. People gathered in small groups, exchanging contact information and discussing their roles. Sophia carefully rolled up the blueprints, tucking them securely under her arm. Max fell into step beside her as they walked to the car, his presence steady and reassuring. The morning sun had risen fully now, casting long shadows across the parking lot as they made their way home. The cardboard boxes sat in neat rows across Sophia's living room floor, each one carefully labeled in an unfamiliar handwriting. "These belong to Greg," James Porter, her father's old colleague, had said when he dropped them off. "He would have wanted you to have them." Sophia opened the first box, Max watching intently from his spot on the couch. Her fingers brushed against soft leather, and she pulled out a weathered sketchbook. The binding was worn, its pages thick with use and time. As she turned each page, her breath caught at the precise lines and detailed annotations that filled them. Gregory's architectural vision flowed through every sketch. Innovative housing concepts, sustainable garden spaces, and community-focused designs. Max padded over and settled beside her as she continued exploring. Then she found it, a series of drawings that made her pause. Unlike the other sketches, these pages contained extensive notes in the margins. "Community shelter, south-facing windows for natural light," one note read. "Recycled materials to reduce costs," said another. The design was thoughtful, incorporating spaces for families, counseling rooms, and even a children's play area. Her fingers traced the careful lines of the blueprint. Gregory had poured his heart into this project, but as she flipped through the remaining pages, she realized it had never moved beyond the planning stage. Sophia reached for her phone, dialing her instructor's number. Her heart raced as she described the discovery. "The design principles are remarkable," she explained, "especially considering when these were drawn." "This could be perfect for your capstone project," her instructor replied, his voice animated. "Gregory's foundation is solid. You could update it with modern sustainable materials and present it to the board." Energized by his response, Sophia spent the next few hours researching local community needs. She created spreadsheets of potential donors and grant opportunities, making notes about current building codes and zoning requirements. Standing up, Sophia walked to her corkboard and carefully pinned Gregory's shelter sketch next to her own designs. Max followed, sitting beside her as she stepped back to study the collection of drawings. "We're going to make this happen, Max," she said with determination. Opening her laptop, she began composing an email to the local nonprofit organization, Hope Bridge, explaining her father's vision and her desire to bring it to life. The autumn breeze rustled through the grove, scattering golden leaves across the worn path as Sophia made her way to the memorial bench. Max padded faithfully beside her, his paws crunching softly on the fallen foliage. The late afternoon sun filtered through the canopy above, creating dancing shadows on the ground. The bench stood solid and dignified beneath the ancient oak tree, its wooden slats weathered but well-maintained. Sophia settled onto it, the bouquet of fresh flowers resting in her lap. Max took his usual position at her feet, his warm presence a constant comfort. She traced the engraved plaque with her fingertips, feeling each carefully carved letter. The grove was quiet, except for the whisper of leaves and occasional birdsong. It felt right here, peaceful in a way that matched her memories of Gregory's better moments. Reaching into her bag, Sophia pulled out the letter she'd read countless times before. The paper had grown soft at its creases, but the words remained clear. As she read aloud, her voice stayed steady despite the emotion building in her throat. Each sentence carried the weight of Gregory's regret, his hope, and ultimately, his love. "You weren't perfect, Dad, but you tried to make things right. "That's what matters," she said softly, folding the letter back into its envelope. The flowers found their place at the base of the bench, their bright petals a splash of color against the earth-toned ground. Sophia sat quietly, reflecting on the whirlwind of changes since that morning when Max appeared on her doorstep. Her life had transformed in ways she never expected. New purpose, healing, and understanding where there had once been only hurt and confusion. A gentle nudge against her hand pulled her from her thoughts. Max looked up at her with those knowing eyes, and Sophia couldn't help but laugh as she wiped away a stray tear. "You always know when I need you, don't you?" she said, scratching behind his ears. His tail thumped against the ground in response. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows through the trees, Sophia stood from the bench. Max fell into step beside her as they walked back toward the car, their footsteps synchronized after months of companionship. The grove glowed in the golden evening light, transforming the familiar path into something almost magical. At the edge of the clearing, Sophia turned for one last look at the bench. Peace settled over her like a warm blanket as she whispered, "Thank you, Dad," before continuing to her car. The nonprofit's office buzzed with quiet energy as Sophia spread Gregory's sketches across the conference table. Her fingers trembled slightly as she smoothed out the weathered papers, but her voice remained steady while explaining her father's vision. Max sat quietly beside her chair, his presence lending her strength. "These were my father's original designs," Sophia explained to the three representatives. "He dreamed of creating a space where families could rebuild their lives." Sarah Chen, the nonprofit's director, leaned forward to study the detailed drawings. "These are remarkably thorough," she said, admiration clear in her voice. "And you've enhanced them?" Sophia nodded, pulling out her own updated designs. "I've maintained the core elements while incorporating modern sustainable features and expanding the community spaces." The following week, Sophia stood at the podium in the community center, her heart racing as she surveyed the crowd. The room was fuller than she'd expected, with familiar and new faces filling the seats. Max sat alertly at the edge of the stage, his eyes never leaving her. Taking a deep breath, Sophia began her presentation. She shared Gregory's story, her voice growing stronger as she described his vision for the shelter. The projector displayed slides of the proposed layout: communal kitchens, private family units, children's play areas, and garden spaces. "This isn't just about providing shelter," Sophia explained, gesturing to the designs. "It's about creating a foundation for new beginnings." Questions came from the audience, each one met with thoughtful responses. Business owners offered materials at cost, contractors volunteered labor, and local artists proposed murals for the children's areas. The energy in the room was electric with possibility. From the back, Dr. Carter raised his hand. "I'd like to offer free veterinary care for any pets belonging to the shelter's residents," he said quietly. "Everyone deserves to keep their family together, including their four-legged family members." Sophia's eyes met his, surprised and touched by the gesture. She nodded gratefully, unable to speak for a moment. After the meeting, Sophia walked to her car, her head spinning with the evening's success. The cool night air helped clear her thoughts. She knelt beside Max in the parking lot, wrapping her arms around his thick fur. "We're really doing this," she whispered into his ear. Max responded with an enthusiastic lick to her face, his tail wagging with shared excitement. The autumn air carried the scent of fresh paint and new beginnings as crowds gathered for the grand opening of the Gregory Willis Community Shelter. Sophia stood near the entrance, her fingers nervously smoothing the red ribbon that stretched across the doorway. Max sat dutifully beside her, looking distinguished in his bright blue bandana, his tail wagging gently at the familiar faces in the crowd. Mayor Thompson stepped up to the podium, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "Today, we celebrate not just a building, but a vision passed from father to daughter," he said, gesturing toward Sophia. Gregory Willis dreamed of creating a space where families could rebuild their lives, and through his daughter's determination, that dream stands before us today. The scissors flashed in the morning light as Sophia cut the ribbon. Applause erupted from the crowd and people began streaming inside, their excited voices echoing through the halls. Sophia led the first tour group, her voice steady as she pointed out the thoughtful details incorporated from her father's original designs. "The communal spaces promote connection," she explained, showing them the bright kitchen area. "But we've also ensured privacy for families who need time to heal." She gestured to the individual units, each designed with both comfort and dignity in mind. Near the entrance, people gathered around a bronze plaque that caught the sunlight. The words engraved there made Sophia's heart swell. "In memory of Gregory Willis, architect of dreams, builder of hope." Dr. Carter approached her as the tour concluded, holding an envelope in his slightly trembling hands. "Thank you for giving me a chance to be part of this," he said softly, presenting her with a donation check for the shelter. Sophia accepted it with a warm smile, recognizing how far they'd both come from that day in his clinic. As evening approached and the crowds thinned, Sophia found a quiet moment on a bench outside the shelter. She watched through the windows as new residents moved in, carrying their belongings into spaces designed with such care and purpose. Max rested his head on her lap, his presence as comforting as always. "We did it, Max," she whispered, running her fingers through his fur. "Dad would be so proud." The shelter's windows glowed warmly against the darkening sky, a beacon of hope for those within. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows of Sophia's design studio, casting warm light across her drafting table. The space, though modest in size, felt alive with creativity and purpose. Gregory's architectural sketches hung alongside her own completed projects, creating a visual timeline of their shared passion. Max lounged contentedly on his cushion near her desk, his watchful eyes following her movements as she worked. Sophia leaned back in her chair, reviewing the final touches on her latest project, an innovative dog park design that incorporated everything she'd learned from her daily walks with Max. Natural play areas, shaded rest zones, and thoughtfully placed water features filled the blueprint. She smiled, remembering how Max's preferences had influenced many of the design choices. Opening her email, Sophia crafted a message to a potential client who had expressed interest in her community-focused approach to architecture. Her fingers moved confidently across the keyboard as she outlined her vision. Business had been steadily growing, each new project building on the reputation she'd established with the shelter. The work filled her with purpose, knowing she was creating spaces that would impact people's lives. As evening approached, Sophia clipped Max's leash to his collar for their daily walk. The familiar route through their neighborhood had become a cherished ritual. Mrs. Henderson waved from her porch, calling out, "The shelter looks wonderful, Sophia. My daughter's friend just moved in last week." A few houses down, Mr. Chen stopped pruning his roses to chat. "My nephew saw your dog park designs," he said, smiling. "He's hoping the city approves them soon." Max sat patiently during these exchanges, his tail wagging gently at the attention. Back home, Sophia moved around her kitchen, preparing a simple dinner while Max watched from his usual spot by the door. The aroma of cooking filled the space as she reflected on how much her life had changed. Setting her plate on the coffee table, she looked at Max with deep affection. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, Max," she said softly. They settled onto the couch together, the room quiet except for the gentle hum of the ceiling fan. Sophia's hand rested on Max's head, finding comfort in his steady presence as evening settled around them. If you enjoyed the story of Max, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.